So how were things going? I mean, last time I talked to you was 3 months ago. How was the situation on the front line?
Really think situation not really good for me. It's we all tired. We all tired. We wanna peace.
We lack. We need manpower. We need equipment. The main thing is the abundance of Russian equipment. There's just too much. There's too many soldiers and stuff.
It's really hard. It's really hard. We don't have enough people.
So what do you want to see happen? Like you say, peace.
I wanna be sure about its war didn't come in to my home again. Like I wanna hear from politics, hear from my president, hear from Trump maybe or somebody else.
Why don't the politicians do their work and sort this thing out? We need Western help for this thing to stop it right here. We do, 110%. If we don't get it, I honestly don't think we're going to be able to hold it for much longer.
And that is the sad commentary by some of the troops on the Ukraine troops on the front lines, as they're asked very candidly. And as you know, from watching our show from any time or any of the Western media, it's very, very rare for the Ukrainian soldiers to make such admissions because ordinarily, they're trying to put a good face on it, et cetera. But for them to say on camera, knowing that those words can go back to the higher command really tells you a lot. And to try to make some sense out of a lot of this, we have Patrick Henningsen back, geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of the SundayWire.com. Patrick, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you, Daniel.
Well, listen, I don't want to say that's that's something good to hear because it just sounds odd to say that when you hear some guys who are trying to defend their country talking about how they're recognizing that the end is closing in. But in a different sense, it is a positive thing because maybe that can start moving the needle back towards reality among the Ukrainian leaders. How do you see this situation on the ground and how it may impact the leaders in Kiev right now?
Yeah, I think, I hate to use that old cliche of the TDS era, but the walls are closing in. I mean, it's kind of obvious when you look at Western mainstream outlets that have been defending Zelensky. They're defending the kind of NATO proxy war narrative for 3 straight years, are now basically all buckling and all sort of collapsing and leaking like a sieve with all this information. In truth, Daniel, this information has been around and available for a very long time. It's just that the Western media collectively haven't had the will or haven't had the green light to let it be known. Coincidentally, the last voice on that video clip was a heavy South African accent, which tells you, as well as I've seen indications, there are still foreign fighters being drafted to come and serve in the quote foreign legion in Ukraine. But they're crazy lowering the mobilization age to 18. That's what's being talked about now. A lot of fissures, a lot of cracks now in Ukrainian society. I think the end is nigh, but it's a very complicated one. I mean, it's not an easy thing to get out of. They're really tied in a Gordian knot in so many different ways. And the blowback publicly from different factions in Ukraine is going to be immense. Especially Zelensky will be obviously the main scapegoat, but there's other people who are going to be targeted if this thing collapses very rapidly, and it looks like it may do. And this also could take on a whole nother dimension geopolitically with the neighboring countries. What does a negotiated settlement eventually look like? I'm sure it's going to mean a very different looking Ukraine than the one that we see now.
Yeah, and we're actually going to get into that here about what the region is because, as the Ukrainian cities keep falling, we've had Chasiv Yar all but fall overnight. Toretsk had fallen before that. The noose around Pokrovsk keeps getting tighter, and now Russia's actually taken what looks to me like preemptive attacks into the city to weaken it before they start an assault. Whether that's on the flanks or the frontal is still to be determined. But its end is all but declared, and the question is, what's going to happen after that, and what's going to happen on the ground negotiations wise, because you still have Zelensky, talking like there's still choices to be made. And look, we just showed you that commentary there by the Ukraine troops. I wonder that's also echoes something that General Budanov, the head of the Secret Service, I guess, or their version of CIA, I think is probably the better analogous, said that if a lot of help doesn't come from the West, that they could literally cease to exist in 6 months from now as a state. What did you make of his comment there? Was that hyperbole, or has he got something else in mind?
Well, I think he's saying the quiet part out loud, that Ukraine is completely reliant on foreign subsidies from its sponsors, the U.S. being, of course, the biggest one, the EU and other European member states. I mean, their whole society is backstopped by foreign cash. So, it's not just the weapons, but it's the money, it's paying pensions, it's putting, money in people's pockets and people's bank accounts to make sure that there's food on the table. If it becomes a gas and groceries issue and not a military conquest issue, Ukraine has some huge problems. And I think this is just a reality that's been staved off for the longest time because of the amount of money and support and political clout and cover that's been flooding the space in there for so long. It's created a real unnatural environment. And, the military itself in Ukraine is they're kind of reduced to basically, plugging gaps here and there. They don't really have any overall strategy. There's some hit and run provocations like we've seen in the last week, drone attacks in 10 different Russian regions. I mean, that's not going to help to ease the situation. It's not going to get them to a better negotiating position, but it's almost like that's all that's left for Ukraine to do, which is basically disruptive tactics, provocations, what Russia would call terrorist attacks. I mean, that's not a really good way to enter negotiations. And the United States is in a very weak position. They don't really have any cards to play on this. And there's not a lot of talk coming out of Washington, any substantive talk about how this is going to take place, because I think that a lot of people in the incoming Trump administration were living in the same propaganda bubble that the Biden administration were living in, that Washington lives in. And so then Christmas and New Year's pass, they're coming into power now, and they're still, I think it's still hitting them. They're still trying to digest the gravity of how far behind the United States is in terms of getting closer to any kind of negotiated settlement. They're not. And there's not many gimmicks that you can play, little sort of parlor tricks that you can do. And, not just with the weapons, but, sabotage operations, all of that's been tried. And so what are you left with? Well, you got to have a political solution. And in a political solution in Ukraine, I'm afraid it doesn't look like it's anywhere near getting close to that. I haven't heard any serious talk about elections. We spoke about that previously.
Yeah.
My theory about how this is going to play out, we can maybe talk about later. I think it's going to be more of an engineered coup, but that's not going to satisfy Moscow.
Yeah. And the problem from if what you're saying is correct on the Trump administration side, that they're trying to grapple with what actually is ground truth reality, what is possible. I think that they're saying, well, we'll figure this out, because Trump hadn't even set a time yet to have a conversation with Putin, or has sent Kellogg to talk with Lavrov, whoever he wants to. That hadn't even been talked about yet. So I think they're still trying to figure it out. Problem is, time is not on their side, because you saw those troops there at the beginning. Those are the guys who were at the front line, and they're saying, I'm not sure we can hang on much longer. Budanov says, hey, if you guys don't give us all this stuff we're asking for, we might not last 6 months. But it may not matter how much stuff you give them if the troops themselves can't maintain what they have with it. If
it lasted, just to a point, if it lasted another 6 months or another 12 months in the current form, Ukraine's looking at losses manpower-wise of plus 100,000. In addition to their existing losses. It's apocalyptic if you think about it.
And it's not even just the number of troops that are lost, as apocalyptic as it is. That's very accurately stated. But it's that they apparently don't understand how to use the manpower that they have. We had this in the Kiev Post. I think this was published. I don't remember if it was today or yesterday. But this is the Kiev folks. These are pro-Kiev. This is not Russia. This is not even the Kiev Independent, which has separated itself from them from early in the war. They say Ukraine's attempt to create top quality combat brigades fast didn't work. And we of course, it's been in the news a lot lately with the 155th Brigade, the 157th Brigade, one of which was trained by Frenchmen and allegedly had all this great intelligence and training or whatever, fell apart before it ever got to the front line. The latest one, another one from the 150th series, new brigades, also didn't even make it to the front line before it collapsed. They're suffering catastrophic losses, not just from the Russians, the physical losses, but people deserting, etc. So the whole fabric of the army is literally coming apart at the seams, and the Ukraine side doesn't seem to have an answer for it.
Yeah, and when you talk about those special forces groups or these elite commando units or smaller, elite units, that's a total reflection of Europe there. Behind that will be the British. Behind that will be the French, because that's all they've got left in terms of active, deployable, effective military units are all these sort of hit and run, sabotage, demolition. That's basically what Britain and France do around in Syria and places around the world. And to think that can be transferred into the combat theater that is Ukraine versus Russia is just madness. I mean, in terms of combined warfare, none of these European countries that are advising, training, and facilitating the Ukrainian armed forces, none of them have hardly any, if any, experience at all in combined warfare against a real opponent in their whole careers, right up to their top generals. It's the same in the United States, as well, aside from maybe a few that are left. So I mean, if they're trying to basically transfer that to the Ukrainians, it's bound to fail.
Well, yeah, it is, and I can assure you that the U.S. side is in the dire straits that you mentioned, because we don't have any combat experience against a real enemy, as you very well put it here. In a recent interview with Sean Hannity a couple of days back, you had Volodymyr Zelensky. He had been asked earlier in the interview about, how's this going to end? And Hannity really tries to keep saying, hey, we're on your side, but at some point this has to end. And are you willing to make sacrifices, et cetera? And he literally wouldn't answer the question. He kept talking everything except what he would actually agree to in negotiations. But then toward the end of the interview, he says, but this could have been stopped. This whole war could have been prevented, which of course got my attention at first, because we've been making that argument that there was diplomatic ways that this could have been offloaded plenty of times. His view about how it could have been prevented is a little bit different. Watch this one.
Before the big-scale invasion, I was personally asking President Biden and his team, the State Department, we were contacting everyone in the White House. We were saying the most effective sanctions will be preventive. Most important response is preventive action. So give us weapons now. And they were saying, we will give you weapons if they invade. And I was saying, do everything you can now. And that may stop his coming invasion. Parallel with that, I was asking the European Union countries, and they could not do it without approval of the United States. So they always look at the leader, the United States as the leader. So during the big invasion, Ukrainians were left on their own, and we were fighting on our own.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they were really on their own. It hadn't gotten anything prior to that. Trump himself put a lot more weapons in before he left office anyway. But would that have made a difference? Because basically what he's saying is that Biden should, and the Western European countries should have essentially come close to calling almost all that war against Russia before, and just flooded the zone with all kinds of ammunition, weapons, tanks, artillery, everything before there was even a war. Is that a realistic possibility? Is he right or is he wrong?
The fact that he's doing this retrospective lamenting about what could have happened, this is a total 180 of what Zelensky has been on, which is this kind of strong and stable, camouflage wearing military era leader, totally confident, and that they're going to defeat the Russians next week, and carrying that act on for years at a time. The fact that he's saying this now, that he's now admitting he has buyer's remorse of the master plan right now, is kind of really indicative of the whole collapse of the narrative. Because I mean, the only thing that's really been keeping this war going, keeping this idea going, has been a real concerted and very clever and well-funded and well-manned propaganda operation that starts in Kiev and goes to Washington, goes to London, goes to Brussels, to Berlin. This is really the foundation of this conflict from the Ukrainian NATO side. And what Zelensky's telling you might well be true, but I don't think so. I don't think the weapons would have made a difference. They weren't. They're probably better. Ukraine's better organized now, and probably tactically better now than they were back then. They're just, into their third or fourth army by now because their losses have been so catastrophic. So it's not that they don't have the knowledge, or they have the knowledge now, and maybe they have some better weaponry now, but they couldn't come out with ATACMS and HIMARS back in February or March of 2022. I mean, that would have just been catastrophic. I mean, Russia would have come in much heavier than they did. Russia has not come in heavy at all in terms of aerial bombardments and things like. It's been a very gradual, incremental conflict to try to avoid any serious civilian casualties, obviously. And even, loads of international organizations have commented on the fact that the civilian casualties in this conflict are just ridiculously low in terms of the overall devastation, the amount of artillery that's been used, the amount of soldiers that have died. I mean, it's almost unheard of in modern warfare. And that's down to the fact that I think Russia's very cognizant of the fact that they won't be able to manage any of these territories if they're inflicting heavy civilian casualties anywhere in the vicinity of any of these areas that they're potentially coming under their administration, obviously. So Zelensky, it's very telling. This is almost like a surrender, to sort of defeat, a pre-surrender speech that he's giving there. Those types of excuses. Oh, if only we had just done this or that 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, this is devastating.
Yeah, and he's still, though, he's unwilling to answer the first question about how we're going to navigate this to its end. So he still isn't all the way there yet on coming to it. But man, you talk about somebody who's disconnected from reality, and we usually hold up Zelensky as the poster child for that, just because of how they're just totally disconnected from what is happening on the ground. That's self-evidently obvious. But I found somebody today that might be a little more detached from reality, and that is former Ukrainian President Poroshenko.
When's the right time to have an election?
Immediately 3 months after we win the war.
Win the war.
Do you know what does it mean, win the war? Very simple. First, there is not existing any other nation in the world who wants peace more than we Ukrainians, because we pay such a high price. You demonstrate that today. But it should be no compromise on the national sovereignty and national identity. We never return back as a colony in the Russian Empire. Second, no compromise on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We never recognize Russian occupation. Third, no compromise on the armed forces of Ukraine and their ability to protect our sovereignty, even in exchange for some security. Fourth, non-compromise on sanctions, who cut the ability of Russia to finance the war and to finance Ukraine rebuilding, including with the assets of the Russian frozen assets. And five, no compromise about our future membership in European Union and in NATO, because without NATO, it would be no sustainable security situation on the continent. Everything else is possible.
Everything else that what you're asking for is total victory in those 5 points that you've just spelled out.
I mean, the anchor himself was like, wait, did you say victory? And then he lays out 5 plans, which sounds like something you would, if I just blocked people's ear and they didn't, and they could only hear, they couldn't see who was talking, you would think, well, that must be some Russian guy talk about how he's going to, all these things have to work in their favor because they're on the ascendancy. But what planet could that guy be on when he's talking about, I mean, no compromise on territory, no compromise on our troop numbers, and, oh, by the way, European Union and NATO. Other than that, everything will work out the way we want.
I'll tell you what planet he's on, Daniel. He's on the planet Azov. He's on the planet Azov. That is a total political pitch he's making there. He's making it to the hard line in Ukraine because they're just as deluded as he is. I don't think he even believes this, by the way. He is a consummate politician, Petro Poroshenko. He's also making that pitch in the English language media, France 24. He's making it to the British political leadership because that's what they want to hear. He's making it to the NATO hardliners, to Mark Rutte, because that's what they want to hear, to the Washington hardliners, because that's what they want to hear. So he's talking to a specific audience there, and he's basically saying, I'm the guy that you may want to consider backing for the next presidential race, or if elections are held. I am going to be a pro-Western, trusted pair of hands for the West. He's opening up with the total victory bargaining position, knowing full well that a lot of these things aren't attainable, but that's not his objective. His objective as a politician is to put himself into a position of power and have powerful forces backing him in that process. That's how I read that.
Okay, well, that actually makes some sense when viewed through that lens. It's totally divorced from ground truth reality, but
Yeah.
from political reality, maybe it's not that far off because it could end up good for him personally, but at a horrific, catastrophic cost for the people of Ukraine. And that's where I think it's just an unforgivable, unpardonable sin that you're literally working off the pile of bodies of your people to create this potential, which is probably possible, that the Western people that you just mentioned, they may actually back him for something like that for the very reason that you mentioned. But I'll tell you who's,
and mind you,
go ahead.
Daniel, he is responsible for putting this country into this position. He pledged to help to advance the Minsk protocols and the Minsk Accords, as did Zelensky, who came in after Poroshenko on the same thing. Both of them promised peace. Both of them promised to end the war, and they've utterly failed. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Poroshenko primarily. He was in there through 2019, and he was the one that was routinely refused to get one of the absolute central parts of the Minsk agreements passed that would have satisfied Russia, which was to change their constitution to give autonomy and protections to the Russian-speaking people in the eastern part. He never even brought it up to a vote. Absolutely refused to do it. Is he the one that did that, as I recall?
Think so, yeah. And he quite strident, racist, almost language that he would employ at certain times as well. Again, talking out of one side of your mouth for the Azov battalion, for the sort of neo-Nazi ultra-nationalists, and then out the other side, talking to the kind of moderate, I want to have peace and harmony and stability and so forth. And this kind of duplicity is not uncommon in that political environment in Ukraine.
Well, and we know how that's worked out for the very people that they claim to want to support. But I'll tell you who it's not fooling, and there's a growing number in Europe that are not buying into any of this. Now, obviously, one of the biggest critics has been almost from the outset, who does see ground truth reality, is Viktor Orban.
As for the question put to me, in the past 3 years, what I saw was that there is no solution on the battleground. I saw people saying things new. I saw new weapons. I see hundreds of people dying, people maimed, women remaining without their husbands, and children remaining without their fathers. So I saw many things, but I don't see how this would bring a solution. Now, if you can't find a solution on the battleground, then you have to do something else. You have to communicate, you have to talk, you have to negotiate, you have to have diplomacy. Diplomacy should take precedence over military engagement.
You know, Orban is so often in the Western media portrayed as a, quote, far right politician, like there's something wrong with him. But every time we actually play a clip, he sounds very modest, very moderate, and very rational. That's not where I see for 3 years nothing but piles of bodies growing and kids without parents, without their fathers, wives without their husbands. That didn't work, so let's try something diplomatically. What is so radical about what he's saying?
Nothing. I mean, he's actually a true conservative. He almost sounds like Ron Paul, but that's Hungary's geopolitical disposition there on the eastern frontier of Europe. They can't afford to take the sort of gambles that Britain are taking with Ukraine, or that the United States or Canada are taking with Ukraine. So Hungary's got very serious implications should the conflict escalate. They have bared the brunt of the migrant crisis into southeastern Europe as well, and they have dealt with that. So, I mean, Orban, I think, has just set himself apart. I mean, this crisis has really made him into a statesman, likes of which it probably wouldn't have happened had this conflict not broken out. And he's met the moment in history. He's gone and done shuttle diplomacy to Moscow. He is with the Chinese, talking to the Chinese. He's in Brussels lobbying as well. And so for me, that's a natural partner for the Trump administration. If they really want to engage in a process, I think you need to have all of the neighboring countries at the table. That includes Hungary, Slovakia, Belarus. The Poles have to be there, and the Romanians as well. I mean, there's just no way around it. You can't exclude, especially any of the neighboring countries, because each of those countries have very specific security concerns that need to be addressed, as well as ethnic oblasts that exist inside of Ukraine. And that leads us to a whole nother conversation is, the Medvedev map, as it was notoriously known, of all of these different oblasts and potential pieces of the western part of Ukraine that could be repatriated perhaps to their mother countries. Hungary is a perfect example with Transcarpathia there. Then they actually take that issue personally. The welfare of ethnic Hungarians in Western Ukraine is a very personal, very near and dear issue, hearts and minds issue for Hungary as a nation. They take personal responsibility for the welfare of those people. So I think you could probably say the same possibly about some of the other ethnic oblasts and areas that exist inside Ukraine. I mean,
Well,
that could be the makings of a potential solution. I mean, it's not going to be good for the Petro Poroshenkos of the world who are like, no, we're not negotiating on our 1991 borders. But let's be realistic. This is how conflicts end in Europe. I mean, come on.
Well, and I mean, to your point there, I mean, let's look at Romania, because they've stirred up the pot here in the last 24 hours or so, and there's a lot of angst going on inside Kiev, because one of the Romanian presidential candidates suggested that, hey, if Ukraine breaks apart, Romania has an interest in those areas. Really, like you said, so this is a NATO ally who's saying, yeah, I mean, sure, the Russia should lose, but if they don't, it would be cool to get this back under our control. I mean, that's looks to me like the political wheels are starting to fall off for the Kiev, so-called unity in NATO.
Yeah, well, Georgescu's views. I mean, this is why he's been, the victim of election rigging in Romania, not just because of this type of statement, but just general will to wind down the conflict. But I mean, listen, it's not. You're gonna have to have a realistic conversation, because the United States is one of the big promoters of Ukrainian ultranationalism, and they have done for the entirety of the Cold War, and then after the Cold War as well. This is really a big part of a U.S. long-term nation building project. And now, because they have empowered and armed and supported some of the most extreme factions over the decades in Ukraine, including, the descendants of former Waffen-SS units, plus the descendants of them as well, decades later, and they've used them as the vanguard to prosecute this proxy war. So, how do you wind this down? It's very, very difficult. This is not going to be. It's going to be it could potentially be very ugly. Any sort of wind down on this conflict inside Ukraine, you could even have potentially a civil war situation. I don't know, but that's the sort of risk for everybody that's very apparent. And so, again, this is a hole that they've dug themselves.
And it's not even just in those countries there. You mentioned Slovakia a second ago. Robert Fico has been very outspoken in saying, hey, it's in our financial and economic benefit, not just national security, have good relations with Russia. He's, went to Moscow, and that angered a lot of people in his country. And in fact, there's a split even within Slovakia of those who really like Fico and that he's looking out for their national interests. But the other side are saying he's a sellout and he's trying to get us out of Europe. Watch this.
Thousands of people have protested across Slovakia against the policies of Prime Minister Robert Fico, who they accuse of being pro-Russia. The latest wave of rallies was fueled by Fico's recent trip to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin, a rare visit to the Kremlin by an EU leader since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Fico's recent remarks that Slovakia could leave the European Union and NATO have also sparked anger among protesters. Earlier this week, Fico accused protest organisers of being in contact with unspecified foreign forces who he says are working towards engineering a coup. Fico linked those accusations to a report by the country's spy service that he presented in Parliament on Tuesday. The opposition dismissed that report and accused Fico of misusing the SIS for political purposes.
So what do you make on what's going on even within Slovakia, that there is this strong pull, one westward, one eastward, and Fico's right in the middle of that?
What you're looking at here is basically a repeat of what we saw in Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia just a few months ago. And what we found from our reporting and our research was a lot of Western NGOs who are funded by Brussels or through the Open Society, George Soros foundations, basically parachuting them in to Georgia to create kind of an unrest and to create opposition columns within there, to give the impression to the foreign media, to the international media, that there's this great grassroots upwelling, a Maidan sort of revolution, if you will, that's fomenting in Georgia. Freedom, freedom is in the air, sort of thing. It's the Arab Spring, etc. A color revolution, and this has all the hallmarks of that exact same thing. The problem is the propaganda is getting so good and becoming so ubiquitous that you will get a lot of purchase from certain people, especially if they're pro-American, pro-Europe, and there is a definite split. There is a schism. I definitely witnessed that in Hungary personally when I was there, of anti-Brussels, pro-Brussels. Very, very clear schisms, becoming very polarized in some of these countries. And so that there's people that are able to capitalize on that. Certainly those people who are pro-Western, who are pro-US, who have bought into this fear-mongering against all things Russian, they will immediately default to that side and go out there with their candles and shake their keychains and all of this. But that's not the basis for a revolution or regime change, because there is a smart center bloc in Slovakia that knows that it's Hobson's choice between Moscow and Washington, and that's kind of like what you're being given there. Either NATO keeps antagonizing towards a war, potentially a regional, maybe a world war, maybe a nuclear exchange or something like that, or we talk to Moscow and we wind this thing down. And so I think that's the majority personally in Georgia, in Slovakia, is the kind of center moderate bloc in the middle. The extremes are very polarized though, and there's no doubt about it. Judging, Fico himself was almost killed in an assassination attempt over this very issue.
Yeah, and it's not even just in the countries that are closer to Russia, like with Hungary or Slovakia, but even in Germany. So there's going to be snap elections next month, where, according to this report, the AfD, so-called, is looking to move Germany in a different direction. These are Western Europeans.
Pro-Russian, anti-American parties are expected to win a quarter of the votes, if not more, in Germany's upcoming elections. The far-right Alternative for Germany and the left-wing conservative Sarah Wagenknecht alliance want Germany to drop sanctions on Russia and start importing Russian gas again. The success of these parties that are skeptical about the US and NATO could present a major challenge to the transatlantic relationship.
So now even Orban has a lot of disputes within his own country, this whole schism, as you called it a second ago. But you see it's starting to crop up everywhere. Why do you suppose that in all these European countries, it's not everybody locked up against Russia, who's having this war with Ukraine? Why are there so many people, even in Western countries, that are starting to say, hey, let's this is dumb. Let's move back in the direction of Russia and anti-American. I mean, to American ears, that sounds odd, but 25% of the electorate, that's a pretty sizable chunk.
Yeah, it is. They've always been there. They've always been there. It's just that now, people are kind of tired of, 0% projected growth in Europe for 2025, and maybe the same maybe negative growth in 2026. And then the cost of living, the cost of energy is going, jobs are fleeing Europe. Manufacturing is being captured by the United States. German companies are leaving for China. They're leaving for the United States. So those are some high skilled jobs that are going, also the prestige of some of these industries. Germany's taking that personally, a lot of Germans, and they're realizing that this isn't about, the culture war issue is very popular among conservatives. I mean, that'll help get you into power. Certainly the AfD have been trading off the immigration issue, and then the culture war issues that people like Elon Musk will parachute in there and push these kind of racial narratives and immigration narratives and identitarian narratives. But the real in politics, the center, when it's awakened, it's going to be over the issue of national sovereignty, i.e., the United States has occupied Germany since the Second World War. And I don't just mean militarily, although that's significant. They've turned them into, a type, it is like kind of a casus belli in Central Europe in that sense. And through the Cold War, that seemed to suit everybody in terms of the balance of power. But rather than leaving, after the Berlin Wall fell, the United States didn't leave. They just ramped up NATO's expansion and brought us to this key point, this inflection point in history. But U.S., make no mistake, the U.S. occupy the media, they occupy the intelligence services, they occupy the captains of industry, and militarily as well. So nothing happens. And then the U.S. determine where Germany can buy its energy from and who it can sell its products to. That's not sovereign. And so if that's the top dog in Europe and they can't make any of their own decisions policy-wise without going through Washington or the proxy of Washington, which is Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels, then that then becomes the real issue. That's an issue that Elon Musk didn't talk about at the AfD rally because that would obviously upset Washington. So Elon kept it in culture war, into the shallow sort of culture war debate. But the real debate is really the sovereignty debate, which is intricately tied to the economic performance debate, which is tied to the cost of living and the welfare and happiness of Germans economically. And so that's, when the economy's buzzing, people aren't fighting with each other over culture war issues. As you can see, when the economy's been tanking the last 3 years, this has helped to bring the AfD into the ascendancy. But once you get into the ascendancy and you have to govern, you have to deal with these real issues. And I think that's happening. I think you could see a coalition, I wouldn't even rule out a Christian Democrat AfD coalition, to be quite honest, with a Christian Democrat leader as chancellor. I mean, stranger things have happened, but something is definitely happening in Germany, and it could be to the detriment of Washington in the long term. That's my.
Well, so let me ask you, with Trump has been making more and more comments about how NATO, European NATO countries need to step up their defense, and that he's kind of saying, hey, we need to take a back seat, not a front seat with what's going on. And, kind of moving military sovereignty back into Europe. Might that actually accelerate that move?
Well, here's the thing. So Trump's play is basically come out hard. That's his negotiation tactics. And so he's saying Europe needs to pay their fair share for defense. They need to pay 5%. of GDP for their defense. They're not contributing for their defense. Well, what do they have to defend against? Russia? Well, who's antagonizing Russia? NATO. Who's leading NATO? The U.S. and Britain. So, like, the U.S. and Britain are creating the problem. But the reality is Europe can't afford 5%. So the negotiation art of the deal will, Trump knows that Europe will settle at 3%. So they prefer to. He's going to say 5, and they'll settle at 3 or 3.5, depending on how hawkish the government
Which
is.
is still not small.
It's huge if you're in budget deficit.
Yeah.
And all of these European countries are running huge deficits, especially France, especially some of the leading Northern European countries. They can't afford to spend 3% of GDP on military hardware from the United States.
And might this not, Patrick, if those governments do say, all right, under pressure, we'll compromise on 3.5%, et cetera, but then that's going to cause potentially anyway some more problems in their domestic economies that other parties may rise up and say, you know what, forget about this. We don't even want to do any of it at all. We'll do whatever we think for our national security. And, Washington can go hang themselves. I don't care, which could then literally put the fabric of NATO at risk.
Anything that's above and beyond discretionary spending when you're running huge deficits, and that's what's going to happen especially if this conflict would ramp up and there'd be more tension between East and West, then there might be pressure to spend more. That's going to create more debt, and this is going to mean inflation. And inflation, it's going to mean if sanctions continue and the price of fuel, they're getting a lot of their fuel imported across the Atlantic, LNG from the United States. Yeah. By the way, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline has bailed out the U.S. fracking industry in ways that nobody could possibly imagine. So to keep that transatlantic trade going, that's also adding to the cost of everything. And meanwhile, the messaging is like, no, we can't trade with Russia, need to keep sanctions on, need to double down. Trump even said, we're going to win this war by pushing the price of oil down. We're going to bankrupt the Russians. I mean, this is just insane. I honestly think, you can do a lot domestically and internationally, but in addition to managing the world, you're trying to wage economic warfare against some of the world's superpowers. I mean, that can kind of outgun you on resources in some ways. It's insane. And I think reality is coming to hit a lot of this tough talk out of the gates from Trump. He doesn't really have a strong hand to play at the table, and you'll start to see them back off a little bit. This is a problem because this is politics, Daniel, is about managing expectations. And the Trump administration come in with huge expectations right out of the gate. They promise the world and more. And if they don't deliver a fraction of that fairly soon, then the piranhas are going to be circling and they're going to be taking chunks out of them, not only out of the Trump himself, but out of all his advisors, maybe out of the Secretary of State, his National Security Council. They will get lambasted. And especially if they're seen to capitulate to Russia or seen to give Putin a win, even though that win is inevitable.
Right. I know that's just, man, I especially Keith Kellogg. I mean, he's kind of setting himself up, and ergo the Trump team, by all this stuff that they've been saying. I don't think that's going to go well.
The best thing that could happen, Daniel, for someone like Kellogg, that could actually change the dynamic of this, is to come out and really push hard for what if he has a solution that he really believes in, but that's not popular in the U.S., push hard for it and then resign. And then that resignation will attract a lot of media attention, and it might alter this conversation. But if they all basically keep this kind of halfway house attitude and delivery, it's just going to keep kicking the can down the road, and the results are going to get worse and worse over time.
Well, and that whole idea of kicking the can down the road, as we talked about at the outset, is getting less and less possible because the can is starting to fall apart. And I showed you Poroshenko and Zelensky and how they were detached from reality earlier. Well, other voices are starting to make more sense and be more honest in Ukraine. And there was a piece in Time magazine yesterday by a former, I think it was a spokeswoman for Zelensky herself, says, hey, Ukraine needs a ceasefire now. And listen, I recommend anybody go look at this because it is absolutely chock full of reality and truth and honesty. And just a couple things I want to highlight here. She wrote that a victory by military means only, though inspiring, may no longer be attainable. At what cost, we must ask, does our continued struggle come? As Ukraine insists on immediate reclaiming of its territories and clings to the increasingly distant prospect of NATO membership, it is losing its nation in other ways. At least 7.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country due to the war, with over 440,000 leaving in just the last year. That's on top of all the stuff. That's a figure 3.3 times larger than in 2023. Russia has turned a third of Ukraine into a living hell. And it just goes on from there. One of the last things she wrote that I thought was really, really telling. She says, this is not an appeal for complacency. It's an appeal for survival. Because she talked about it, I know everybody wants all these things like Poroshenko. She could have been talking about Poroshenko. Well, I think that he made those comments on the same day, so she already had it written by then, but she might as well have been directly talking about that. He's having this 5-point plan of total victory when the wheels are falling off and people are dying left and right. And now she's saying this is an appeal for survival. So we're going to have to do something. Do you think that trend is going to continue, or maybe a better question is, how do you think reality on the ground is going to impale the Zelensky regime to finally start doing something that makes sense? Because as I see it, if he doesn't, there's just going to be a Russian military victory, maybe all the way to the Dnieper, maybe up to the gates of Kiev itself.
The only saving grace Zelensky may have at this point is the Western vanity, is NATO's collective ego, the collective vanity of the West, that they don't want to see this situation spiral so badly out of control that they will want to hit the brakes on it sooner than later. That's about the only thing. Zelensky himself politically is a spent force. I think he'll have to flee the country because he will invariably be the scapegoat. There's nobody who else could you scapegoat? It's not Biden. Biden's out. He's retired, so you can't blame Trump. The British last 5 or whatever prime ministers, or Boris Johnson, whoever, that's not going to happen. It's Zelensky. Zelensky's going to take the brunt of it. So he's going to have to do a quick exit stage left. And I think that his likely replacement, A, has to be somebody that the military will respect and listen to, and B, somebody that has a fairly decent approval rating and is pro-Western, because any coup to remove Zelensky or allow him to resign is going to have somebody that's, a figurehead that's going to work. And I don't know.
Who do you think that is?
I think it's Valery Zaluzhny, who the British have been grooming in London. And so that's, to me, the likely one. Alexei Arestovich in the U.S., he's there. He's too pro-Russian, probably for the West liking. And then there are a number of other potential political candidates within the Rada, within the Ukrainian parliamentary system, that could step up and become the new face of Ukraine. But it's going to be a transitional phase. The human capital that they've lost, you mentioned that article there, great article there in Times about the people that have left the country, plus the young men who have died. They have a human resource issue. That glut is not going to be plugged by Africans. This is a very nativist country. So that post-war era in Ukraine is going to be very painful. It can't be. Russians aren't going to fill those jobs coming in from Russia. So what do you have CIS countries like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and the people in Western Ukraine are very kind of almost white nationalist in their kind of outlook of society. So they're not going to accept Central Asians. So they're in trouble. This country is in real trouble. Maybe the only thing that could save this country is if it is pared down to a very small size, because there's no way they're not going to recapture the whole of Ukraine. So you're really talking anyway about a smaller Ukraine, but it could be an even smaller Ukraine. That might be the solution, is a sort of neutral kind of mini Austria in the middle of Central Europe there. That might actually work. So all those things we talked about before, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Belarus, reclaiming some land that they believe is rightfully theirs because of the map-making exercise of the end of the First World War or the Second World War, that they can repatriate some of that land and everybody's happy. That might end up being the consensus solution. It's just people haven't admitted that might actually end up being the most viable solution.
Yeah, I think people are starting to talk about that behind the scenes, but it hadn't made it out public yet. Although this move by Romania may be an opening gambit. We'll see what happens in the days ahead. But we'll keep doing that with all of these things. We'll keep tracking this. We're still waiting on the Trump administration to even give a clue what even the broad outlines of what kind of a deal they want to get out. So far, we've only had the word "the deal" with no details whatsoever. So we'll wait and see how that is, and we'll probably have you back on to analyze that as well. So thank you for coming back on today. Really appreciate it. Oh, and yeah, and also to remind everybody, the 21st Century Wire there, that's what host Patrick Henningson has. And anything new coming up? Any kind of headlines you want to give us about this coming weekend?
Well, we got a great piece about Yalta 2.0, the proposition from one of our journalists about a second Yalta, that could be a road to stability in Europe. And we also have a midweek wire that we've launched this week. So we have a Wednesday show as well. And we talked about that went live today, a little bit late, but we talked about the situation in Europe and Nord Stream and so forth. And we'll also be breaking a pretty big story on the Nord Stream pipeline in the next couple of days. And, there'll be obviously scope to talk about that in the coming weeks as well, because that story, to me, is just heating up now.
Oh, wow. Well, I'll be interested in watching that myself. 21stCenturyWire.com with Patrick Henningson. Thanks very much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Dan.
And